So first question to give me a sense of the audience. How many of you have science backgrounds? Okay, so how many of you know nothing about science? How many find, okay, good. So I'll give myself, okay, good. Nice mixed audience, okay. So I'm going to cover some questions about science and faith and how to think about them. These are big questions. I'm going to just touch on it a little bit, and feel free to interrupt me anytime with questions. So I'm not actually expecting to cover all the material that I prepared. That's just fine, because I'm more interested in talking about something in more detail that you're interested in, rather than trying to give you an impossible thing, which is give an overview of science and faith. They're very interesting topics. They're complicated and fun. So I'm going to talk about science, faith, and public engagement. Just so that you know, in science, we've got research groups. And so this is a part of my research group. And the way it works in science is that you actually, I've got PhD students and postdocs that do most of the work. And I kind of travel around talking about what they've done. As part of the fun of this field is that you have all these really interesting people that you meet with, young people that are very smart and very interesting. I'm interested in all kinds of interesting topics. One of the things that one of my students got me interested in is the following projects. I was doing normal physics, about 10 years ago, somebody showed me this video. That video is a little bacterium. Bacteria, actually, a lot of them can swim, and they swim with this little motor that you see right here. It's called the flagellar motor. It's a little tiny thing of maybe 50 nanometers across. It can spin at 100,000 RPM. It can stop in a quarter of a turn. Okay? It's an amazing little piece of nanomachinery. Now, if I showed you one of these, and I held it in my hand, it would be made in a factory, right? Because it's a very complicated thing. And it's got to make itself in just the right way each time. The kind of crazy thing is that these bacteria are doing this continuously, and this is a little tail that they swim with. So I saw that video. It's actually an animation by a Japanese scientist called Keiji Namba. He told me he spent $100,000, back before animations were cheap, to make it. And we thought that it wasn't wasted money, because he convinced the funders to give him many millions of dollars to work on this topic. So it was a good investment. It just tells you that making movies is a good thing. So this is what we kind of think happens. And what's kind of fun to think about right now is, you may not realize this, but you have about as many bacteria in your body as you have cells in your body. So that's not because you're ill. It's because bacteria, for example, in your guts help you digest things. Like, you are part bacteria. If you took all the bacteria out of you, you would become very ill. Humans are actually symbiotic creatures. We're partially bacteria. So this process takes about 20 minutes. So while I'm speaking to you, this is happening inside of you millions of times during my talk. Okay, right now, in your body, this is happening. Bacteria are doing this in your gut. Don't worry, it's totally fine. It's actually good for you. But it's kind of a mysterious, one of these kind of things that we've discovered in science. And then you start thinking about lots of questions. And one of the great things about being a scientist is that I get paid to think about what I think is interesting. So I saw this video, and I thought, there's lots of interesting questions there. First of all, how on earth do these things know where to go? Like, there's no factory making them. They literally, the bacteria makes these little things, and they float around like Lego blocks, okay? That's shaking around. It's a bit like taking Lego blocks, putting them in a box, shaking the box, and out comes, a fully formed train. Right? So that's extremely cool, if you think about it. It's happening right now in your body all the time. Your body's full of things that self-assemble. So I'd like to understand how that works. Like, how does that work? Right? Imagine if I could figure that out. I could then maybe emulate it and use it to make medicine or to make technology, do all kinds of cool stuff. Right? So that's kind of cool. Isn't that fun? So I want to teach you some science. This is really cool. So that's super cool. The other kind of interesting thing about this is that we think that God may have created this by partially by an evolutionary mechanism. That's even crazier, right? So it's one thing to make these things. It's another thing to have these things evolve into these beautifully symmetric structures without anybody making it symmetric. Right? How did that work? Right? So that's 10 years I saw this video, and I stopped what I was doing on another project and started working on trying to understand self-assembly, and then trying to understand the evolution of self-assembly, which seemed completely crazy. So I talked yesterday a little bit about evolution and self-assembly and symmetry, and one of the things that we discovered in our group is that if you use this evolutionary process, you naturally make these symmetric structures, and that's the kind of thing you need to make these kinds of flagellar things. So that's super cool. Right? So I think it's very cool and very exciting. I'm very excited about it. And one of the things I'm pointing this out to you is that science is really fun. We get paid money to think about what we think is interesting. It's your tax money, so thank you very much. But it's interesting. Now, I've just told you this story, and for some people, this raises all kinds of existential questions, like what does this mean? Does it tell us something about God? Does it not tell us something about God? Is it in favor of God, or is it against God? Those kinds of questions that raise people's minds. And what I want to talk about you today in this kind of more training session is how do you engage with the public on these kinds of topics? I just showed you some cool science, and most of our science engagement is about trying to convince the public that science is cool and they should give us more money, effectively. Is what we're really trying to say. But there's another kind of engagement as a Christian you might have is how do you engage with the public about these scientific questions? People often have very strong feelings about science. So there's a documentary series I made called Why Are We Here with my friend David Malone, who's an agnostic filmmaker. We looked at a wide range of different topics like beauty and the non-material world. And these are all different aspects that science kind of connects to. These are kind of philosophical, theological questions that were there. And we talked about, these big questions, but in the background, what we were both against, both David, who's an agnostic, and me, who's a Christian, is this idea in our world, what we call scientism. And so scientism, I'm going to define that for you. Who's heard of scientism before? Just a few. So good. So some of you have. So scientism, I'll explain to you what it is. It's the idea that science is the only legitimate way to find truth, or it's the best way to find truth. And in its more extreme versions, it actually says, if something isn't scientific, it's not even worth knowing. Now, interestingly, if you start thinking about it in a bit more detail, it's a somewhat silly idea, okay? Simply because, for example, the definition that only things that science can discover are true is a philosophical definition, which by definition is not scientific. So we say it's self-referentially incoherent, which is a fancy way of saying scientism doesn't actually make sense on its own. It needs outside input to tell you whether it's true or not. It takes a long time for people that believe in scientism to realize this. But I did a debate a few years ago at ETH with a well-known astrophysicist here who has written a lot of popular books. And I just realized halfway through the debate that he was basically believed in scientism and believed that science was the only answer to all truth. And when I made this point to him, he looked this confused because he hadn't thought this through. And the reason I'm pointing this out is that very often the kind of popularizers of the idea that scientism explains everything haven't really thought very carefully about what they're saying. What they do is they wrap themselves in the mantle of science. They say, I'm a great scientist, look at the great science I've done, therefore I know a lot about everything else, and you should trust me. Does that make sense? All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is three things. I'm going to first give you a theology of science, like what is a scientist actually doing, what I think as a Christian I'm doing in the lab. Then I'll talk very briefly about something called natural theology, which is, can I look at nature and extract something about God? So if I look at that video, does that tell me something about God or not? Right? That's a good question. And then if I have time, I'll talk on some zombie myths. So here is the popular perceptions of science and faith. Christians are often a bit afraid of science. They worry that a scientist is going to say, in a German accent, science is proven, there is no God. Yes? I always say that's because people think German science is very good. But what actually happens in scientism, and you see this a lot if you watch popular science programs, they actually give a lot of what are effectively anti-Christian, atheistic kind of worldview ideas. The world is nothing but atoms and molecules. If you believe in gods and fairies and you're somehow not very rational, these are all the kinds of ideas that are floating around in scientism. This is why people who are not Christians often think that science has made God irrelevant. It's called scientism. And that's, I think, if you are wanting to talk to your friends who are not Christians, it's often a kind of this scientism that's playing in the background. And I don't think many people, if they really necessarily believe in scientism fully, although some popularizers do, but it acts as a kind of background belief. So I don't really know much about how this works, but Richard Dawkins has said that there is no God, and therefore I don't have to think about it because he's done the thinking for me. I mean, Christians do this sometimes too. We have, say, a theologian has thought about this, therefore I don't need to think about it anymore. That's not necessarily always a bad idea, but it does, in this case, it is a bad idea. So when we think about science and faith, and you're interacting these things, the most important thing to remember is that it's a bit like an iceberg. At the surface are these questions about that you might be discussing about science and faith. What is the Big Bang mean, etc.? But underneath it, okay, are a whole series of more complicated questions, theological and philosophical questions. And Christians sometimes get themselves confused and want to argue about the things that are at the surface, to argue about the Big Bang, argue about evolution and creation, about the science aspect of it, without realizing that actually underneath are much more important questions on which we actually disagree, and that you kind of have to think about those underneath questions first. So I'm going to try to talk about those underneath questions first. And I think one of my favorite quotes, so theology, I say theology, it's a fancy word, but it basically means the study of God. It doesn't mean the study of God, but the study of everything in the light of God, right? So what I mean by that is not that, for example, when I look at science, I'm trying to look at what does that tell me about God. Actually, it's the other way around. As a Christian, I can look at science, and this tells me something bigger. This is my favorite quote from C.S. Lewis, which I'm sure you've heard by other speakers give as well. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, because by it I see everything else. So how do we as Christians think about science? So this first section is going to be, what's a Christian way of thinking about science, Christian theology of science. And so we need to go back to Scripture and ask ourselves, what does Scripture say? And that actually, interestingly, the Bible doesn't talk very much about science. Science is a fairly modern thing, right? It's a modern set of ideas. The Bible doesn't also talk about lots of modern ideas. It talks about much more important, big questions. Right? But there is a very deep theological theme throughout the Bible of how God engages with creation. Right? And I really recommend this little book by Mike Lloyd, who's in Oxford, called Cafe Theology. If you, I don't know if there's a German version of it. Not yet. Not yet, but there should be. It's a very nice little walk through various theological themes. And one of the important things as well for you to think about is when you think about something like science and faith, what you shouldn't do is try to look for one verse in the Bible that's going to explain to you how science and faith interact. But you can look at themes through Scripture. Right? And one of the really interesting themes is this theme of creation. So what it tells us is that that God created the world. Those actually, if you look at those passages, for example, in Genesis, a very famous example, part of what they're actually saying is not just God created the world, but there is just one God. All the other gods of the time are not real gods. That's why you have this imagery of kind of sea creatures and things like that that you see throughout creation passages. Those are pushing against myths of the time of how people thought that the earth was created. So they're very strong theological passages. It tells us that creation is distinct from God, that creation is dependent on God. It tells us that creation is good. This is a very interesting and important thing to understand. It tells us that creation has value, that it has purpose. It tells us that we are made in God's image and that we have a creation mandate. So actually, when you start looking through Scripture, you'll find that passages about creation go from Genesis all the way to Revelation in many different ways. This is being used in many different ways. The Bible is talking about this. So although the Bible doesn't talk about science, because science is a modern kind of thing, it does talk a lot about creation. It tells us a lot about the natural world and how we should engage with it. And so that means when we start thinking about what does the Bible tell us about science, what am I doing in my laboratory as a Christian? Right? I want to think about that as a Christian. I want to start with Scripture, understand the doctrine of creation, understand what it means that God interacts with the natural world, and then from that perspective, I want to look at what I'm doing in my science. So what we see, one very important theme, creation is not primarily about the beginnings. It's not about how God made the world. The doctrine of creation is about God's interaction with the world, the fact that God's continuously interacting with the world that He made. Right? So Christians sometimes think that the doctrine of creation is about the beginning, because the word creation makes you think of the beginning. That's actually not what the doctrine is about, primarily. It's one of the aspects. But perhaps one of the interesting aspects, obviously, but it's also very interesting to ask yourself, how is God continuously engaging with it? And so what we see is many interesting passages that talk about God's interaction with nature. You can read through the Psalms, you can read through all over the place, you can read this. And I'm going to focus on one aspect of this, which is, you see this in the famous Christological passages in Colossians and Hebrews, where it's basically talking about Christ. In Colossians 1, it says, For by Him, Christ, all things were created, and in Him all things hold together. Or in Hebrews 1, we see the Son is the radiance of God's glory, sustaining all things by His powerful word. You can see something similar here in this Revelations passage. So what does this mean? Okay, God didn't just create the world, but God sustains the world. And interestingly, if you look at the origins of modern science has deep Christian roots. That means that the idea that you can do science is actually a profoundly Christian idea. And one of the reasons for that is when you do science, you assume that the same things happen here as they happen in Oxford, as they happen in Cambridge, even in Cambridge. If they do experiments, they should get the same result under the same conditions, right? If they're smart, at least in Cambridge, who knows? But that's not at all obvious to most people in most time. Their experience of nature is often that nature is unpredictable. So what you see in the early scientists, they start thinking about these things. So you see this in Johannes Kepler, early scientist. I was thinking God's thoughts after him. This is John Donne, who was a poet who wrote quite a long time ago, an act of God is so marvelous that only the daily doing of it takes away the admiration. It's a fancy way of saying, he's actually looking at the sun rising and the sun setting and pointing out that this is happening again and again. And this is Donald Mackay commenting on this literature, saying, if God were to stop sustaining all things, the world will stop existing. So Christians and non-Christians sometimes think that doctrine of creation is something like this. God set the world going and set up really, really well, and now it's running, okay? And in order to understand what God did, we've got to go back to the beginning and understand what happened at the beginning. But actually, the doctrine of creation is, if God were to stop sustaining the world as part of the doctrine of creation, the world wouldn't slowly grind to a halt because God isn't fixing it ever so often. It would not exist. It would be gone, okay? So we believe that God created the world out of nothingness, right? We don't mean out of a quantum vacuum. We mean out of nothing. So no laws of logic, no laws of mathematics, no nothing. It's really hard to understand or put your head around what that is, but that's where God created the world out of. If God were to stop staying in the world, it would go back to nothingness. There would be no trace of it, no nothing. It would be just gone. So once you realize that, then it's kind of interesting, right? God is constantly sustaining the world. So what am I doing in my science? So I told you, historically, the founders of modern science were thinking about these questions all the time. Like, wait, if God is sustaining the world, what should I expect? If there's an intelligence behind the world, maybe I could understand that. Maybe there's something intelligible about the world. Those are the kinds of questions that were playing through their minds. And you see this actually in a very famous exchange between Newton and Leibniz. So Isaac Newton very famously worked out the law of gravity. And one of his first applications was the orbits of planets around the sun. So Kepler, who I just quoted, works out that the orbits of planets around the sun are ellipses, and Newton worked out that gravity exactly gives you these beautiful elliptical orbits. So he goes, yes, proof of gravity. But then somebody said to him, but Sir Isaac, have you thought about the following, that the Earth goes around the sun, but so does Jupiter, but in your gravity theory, Jupiter also has a gravitational attraction to the Earth, okay? And so do all the other planets. So all the planets are pulling on the Earth, as well as the sun. And then if you put that into your equations, it looks like after a little while, the Earth is going to be shot out of the solar system. That's a problem, right? So suddenly your beautiful theory is not quite explaining what you thought it would explain, because you've got to figure this out. So Newton scratched his head and he said, I think God occasionally sends a comet through, right? So it's just as everything's going wobbly, he sends a comet through at just the right angle, and that fixes the planets, right? And that's possible. God could do that, right? And why not, right? But actually Leibniz, who was his great adversary, objected, because he said, and I think as you kind of intuitively feel, if God had to remedy the defects of his creation, right, that was to demean his craftsmanship. That's fancy English for saying, if God had to fix it by throwing a comet through every so often, somehow it means like he didn't do it right the first time. Yeah? And so Leibniz said that, and then Leibniz said something else which I think is much more profound. He said, when God works, I won't read I'll put the quote up here, but I'll tell you what he said in normal English, because some of you this might be complicated. He said, God does miracles. Like a miracle would be God intervening in the planetary system to keep the Earth in place. God does those for his divine purposes, for means of grace. God does that, in redemption history, right? But God doesn't just do that like that. God is not a magician up in the sky who does this for the fun of it. Right? It makes a lot more sense. I think we intuitively sense that if God were to create the planets in such a way that they're stable, in such a way that there's an Earth that has a stable orbit, which allows our temperature not to rise and fall too much, which allows life to occur, all the kind of fine-tuning things you need, they're just right to allow life to occur, then it's better that that's done that way, then God has to continuously intervene. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And if you look in Scripture, for example, at the language around miracles, you see this. So in the New Testament, there are 3 words that are used for miracles. One means wonder, one means dunamis, a manifestation of power, like dynamic, dunamis, right? And then semeion, a sign, semeionic signs, right? So interestingly, that wonder, that word of a wonder, is always used with one of the 2 words next to it. Right? That means God is not like a magician who does stuff to surprise us. God does miracles as an act of power, most importantly to show how God raised Jesus from the dead, and God does miracles as signs. Right? And then once you realize that, we realize that God can do miracles in our lives, God can do miracles today, but they're never done as wonders. They're always done as manifestations of power, as signs. And so if somebody comes to me in my laboratory and says, I think I've discovered a miracle in the lab, I'm going to be skeptical on theological grounds. Okay? And the reason I'm going to be skeptical is what is going to be the sign or the work of power that God's trying to do in that miracle. So what I'm actually studying then is the ordinary ways that God sustains the world. I expect there to be regular things that I can study that are going to be well ordered and well understood. And that is a super important concept. It's not just, I'm not trying to find afterwards a way to explain how science works. This is what Christian theologians were thinking about first before they started to do science. And once they realized this is the way God works, they then went out to study science. This is the actual deep origins of science. And this is super important for Christians because Christians sometimes think that God is only there in the miraculous things. Right? We go in the Spirit was there, we could sense the Spirit was there, something happened. And I'm not going to say that's, if you're in more charismatic movements, this is how you talk about the service afterwards. I don't want to dismiss that. I think it's an important way that we can interact with God. But we should be really careful that we don't think that God is only there in these special moments. God is always there. So when I'm going in my scientific lab and I'm discovering something about the symmetry of the world, I'm discovering something about the way that God sustains the world. And on theism, so if I assume that there's a God and I look at the natural world, I expect there to be beauty and to be beautiful things like what I think I discovered. Because I expect that's the way that God created the world. I expect in the regular ways that God sustained the world to find those kinds of patterns. Does that make sense? So this is probably the most important theological thing I wanted to kind of cover today for Christians, to think, so what is it that we're doing when we're doing science, and why we shouldn't be afraid of science, why we should expect there to be these kind of patterns, and why you should not think that God is only there in these special things, but God is always present in the ordinary things. Does that make sense? Here's the thing to think about as well. If God created the world and the laws of nature, then God can also do things in different ways. So people sometimes say to me, oh, there's a big problem for Christians and scientists and miracles, because how could that do? And there's no problem at all. Once you believe that there is a God who created the world and sustains the world, so that when I study the laws of physics, I'm studying the way that God ordinarily sustains the world, it's not surprising that God could sometimes sustain the world in a different way, which doesn't follow the laws of physics. Does that make sense? And so what I'm trying to say is, when you look at the sun rising and the sun setting, it happens exactly the same way each time. That doesn't mean that God is not, in the end of the day, sustaining that this is what we're seeing is something about God's glory in the ordinary ways that God works. If you're the one who's making the sun rise and set in the first place, it's not that surprising that you could do so. So it is true that for scientists, miracles are odd things, but the minute you believe in God, they're not surprising at all. They would be true. In fact, I sometimes think, I would expect there to be more miracles than we actually see as a scientist, because if God created the world, could he not do it in lots of different ways? That's my main point I'm trying to make. So what's the theology of science? The theology of science is trying to understand the ordinary ways that God works in this world. If you think about science and faith, people sometimes think that we've got science on one side, faith on the other, or that there's some kind of overlap between them. Here's our faith and there's science and overlap each other. But I think the way you should think about it is a big circle. So your faith is a much bigger picture of the world. Okay? It includes your prayer life, it includes your reading the Bible, it includes what you think is going to happen to you after you die, but it also includes what's happening on this earth right now, what's happening in my lab. Those things are all connected to our faith. And our faith should be a big picture within which everything will fit. In practice, there are always things in this world that we don't quite understand, and we don't quite know where they fit into this big picture. Right? But we believe that this is the right way of thinking about it. So rather than these things being in conflict with each other, we think of our faith being the big picture underneath which everything else flows. The next thing I want to talk about is the idea of natural theology. So what is natural theology? Okay, I just did theology of science. I did a theology of science for you very quickly, not very thoroughly, but just to give you a flavor of what it is. Now I'm going to talk about natural theology. So here is one of my great heroes. This is Francis Collins, who was the man who headed the Human Genome Project when we decoded the human genome. He was for many years the head of the NIH, which is the big American health, $40 billion a year budget. So the world's most powerful scientist for many years. And he talks about his own conversion from atheism to Christianity in his mid-20s. The fact that for a work of a scientist in this project, particularly a scientist who has the joy of also being a Christian, is a work of discovery which can also be a form of worship. As a scientist, one of the most exhilarating experiences is to learn something that no human has understood before, to have a chance to see the glory of creation, the intricacy of it, the beauty of it is really an experience not to be matched. Scientists who don't have a personal faith in God also undoubtedly experience the exhilaration of discovery, but to have that joy of discovery mixed with it together with the joy of worship is a powerful moment for a Christian who's also a scientist. So what he's saying here is the following: as we understand more about science, we actually are drawn to worship. Okay, so when you go out into the night sky and you see the beautiful stars and you sense something that's bigger than yourself, that's a really wonderful thing that I think God has created for us. And there are passages, again, in Scripture, like in Romans 1, that tell us that there's something about the world that points towards God in this way. So I think these are important questions. And what Francis is saying here is, as you make a new discovery, maybe with your telescope or with your microscope, you learn something even more beautiful about the world, and it points you towards worship. Because why is it pointing towards worship? It's not because there's a miracle that happens in your science. It's because you understand something about the grandeur and greatness of God. And interestingly, I skipped ahead on his conversion story. In his conversion story, he talks about going in the mountains and seeing a frozen waterfall. He said, it was a beautiful afternoon, and suddenly the remarkable beauty of creation around me was so overwhelming, I felt I cannot resist this another moment. And he comes on his knees and gives his life to Christ. Now, this is beautiful, okay? But he's a scientist. There's no miracle in this frozen waterfall, okay? Why is a waterfall frozen? When the temperature goes below zero, water freezes, right? But it's beautiful, right? And so you look at it and you think to yourself, wow, that's really amazing. And so I think it's an important thing for us to remember that we can look at the natural world that God has made and we can see something about God in that. And I think that sometimes in our modern world that's been taken away from us, or when it's presented to us, here's something beautiful about nature, we understand that, therefore there's no God, is the kind of thing that scientism is often telling you. But that's just not good theological thinking. Good theological thinking tells us there's something beautiful about the world that we understand, and it points us towards God. I'm illustrating this with one of the world's greatest scientists and how he came to faith. And there's no apology. He doesn't have to make an apology for the fact that we understand how waterfalls freeze, because he obviously sees the beauty of it and it points him towards God. Does that make sense? It's one of the main points I want you to take away from this. This is what I was doing there was a kind of natural theology. The theologians will know that there's lots of complications about how to do that. The main point is that when you look at the natural world, right, how you interpret that natural world has a lot to do with what your assumptions are bringing into it. If you assume there is no God and you look at the natural world, then you're not going to see God necessarily in it. But if you say, what if there is a God, and you look at the natural world, then it will reinforce and help you understand that better, is one of the main points that I'm trying to make. So I think I'm going to stop here, do Q&A. And what I did is I told you I was not going to do a proper covering of all of science and faith, just touch on a few things. So I basically told you, first of all, that Christians need to have a good theology of science, particularly those who are in the sciences, to ask themselves, what are they doing in the lab? And we're studying the ordinary ways that God sustains the world. And then I tried to tell you that actually that tells us or explains something to us, which is that we should be able to look at the natural world from a Christian point of view and see something of the glory and majesty of God in it, and not be afraid to make those kinds of points. So rather than doing a kind of apologetics argument, trying to say this is where God fits into the science, I try to do something very different and just say this is the gap in something we don't understand, therefore God must be there. Often Christians say to me, isn't it amazing that we don't understand X? God must be there. That's not really a good Christian way of thinking about things. It's God in the gaps, right? And I think we should point towards God in the things that we do understand. That was my main takeaway, 2 takeaways for today. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions on any other topic on science and faith that you were interested in. I'm very happy to talk on anything. So fire away.
So say you're speaking with a colleague at work who's like, science has explained God away, and any kind of theism is wishful thinking. How do you, if you want to get into this conversation, bring this assumption that like science is the only way to truth? How to bring that to the forefront of their mind? Because many people are just not aware of it.
Great, that's an excellent question. So the question is basically, when somebody, and I've had this many times, people say to me, science is the only way of achieving truth. How could you be a scientist and a Christian? Don't those things contradict each other? Isn't that bad? And the question is, how do you help people understand that nobody lives their life that way, including the person that just asked you that question? So it's like I've actually realized that when somebody asks you that question, they don't understand what they're doing. And so you try to can you find an example of how you can help them break that? So a lot of a good apologetics is actually about helping people understand what they actually think. Right? So here's an example I often give. So we believe that human beings have value, human rights, for example, they have intrinsic value. And we believe, in our Western society at least, that value is independent of whether they're rich or poor, male, female, tall, short, black, white, every characteristic you can think of is independent. Their value is independent of that. It's a very important part of our modern thinking. Right? And almost certainly your colleague will believe that. And then you ask yourself, what scientific experiment or measurement is going to give you that knowledge? Okay, we both agree this is a truth, this is knowledge. Where's that knowledge going to come from? Well, what are you going to do? If you're a chemist, right, I'm going to study the value of the elements in your body, but surely somebody with gold fillings is not worth more than somebody without gold fillings, right? If I'm a psychologist, I might measure how smart you are, but surely our intelligence is not what gives us our value, right? I can look at anthropologists and look at how the community engages with you, but that's also not where our value comes from. I can be an economist and calculate how much value you produce, but even though our government sometimes treats us that way, that's not how we think value. Our value is intrinsic, okay? So ask them, where does that come from? What science is going to tell you? No science is going to answer that. In fact, not only is no science, but no advance of science will ever answer that question because it's a non-scientific question. Is it important? For sure it is. Right? In fact, I would go around the other way around. I'd say if you start thinking that science is the only way of answering questions, you will immediately destroy this idea of human rights, of equal value of human beings, because when you start measuring things, everybody's different. So where does that come from? Well, historically, the idea comes from Christianity. Okay, it comes from the idea that we have value because we are created and loved by God. It's part of the doctrine of creation. That's why humans have intrinsic dignity and value. It comes from God. That's how Christians think about it. My grandparents were humanists, and my grandmother's still alive. She's still a humanist. And I just ask her, why do you believe that humans have intrinsic value? I just believe it's true. It's just a fact. And I'd say, well, where does that fact come from? Why are you asking such a silly question? Would be the answer. But that's perfectly fine. It's just not very intellectually sound or satisfying. It's much more intellectually satisfying to say this comes from belief in God. So the reason I'm giving you this example is there are many, many, many other values that people hold that they believe are genuinely true, that we think is important that they believe are true, that science simply does not, and no amount of science will ever give an answer to. And this is a very simple example. Right? And so once you think about that, I think science is super important. I think our society should spend more money on science. We should train more scientists. I think we should do more science. Science is going to help our world better. But I don't ever think that science is going to answer most of the really important questions like this one. And so what you see, if you look at in our movie that we did, then Why Are We Here? We're looking at scientism. We interviewed a philosopher called Alex Rosenberg, who has a book on who believes in scientism. And what I really liked him because he and I absolutely agree on the logic, which is once you believe there's nothing but atoms and molecules, there's no good, there's no evil, morality is an illusion, free will is an illusion, all the things that you think are valuable, love is an illusion, all these things are illusions. You may think they're happy illusions, good illusions, but they're not real. Okay? And that's the inevitable consequence of your belief that science is the only thing that gives you answers. Now, few people are willing to make that logical connection, but that is the logical connection. And the reason why Alex Rosenberg makes it is because he's a philosopher and likes to be rigorous in his thinking. So one of the fun we had in our movie is that my colleague David, who was the filmmaker, believes in love and in morals and in the intrinsic value of human beings, but doesn't believe in God and wants to ground those in something else. And so in the movie, Alex and I both agree that if you believe there's nothing but atoms and molecules, you can't hold to those things and be irrational. Does that make sense? So once you're thinking about it, most important things that we really care about in our lives have no scientific basis, and no advance of science is going to ever explain them. They're non-scientific truths. But actually, mathematics is a non-scientific truth. Okay? What do I mean by that? So we all believe that 1 + 1 is equal to 2. Okay? Where does that come from? Well, that's a truth that's just there, right? Well, where is it, right? It's not instantiated. We see it reflected in the natural world, but we believe it's true before we ever discovered it in the natural world. It's just true, right? Where is that fact living, right? It's not part of our scientific world. It's something that's non-scientific. And once you realize that mathematics is true regardless of whether you believe or not, it's a non-material reality. It's not such a big step to think there might be moral realities or there might be spiritual realities. So you asked a really good question, which is not a question that I kind of answered. A question that I kind of did. This question is, how do you get your friends who you're talking to see the inconsistency in their thoughts? Well, this is why, oftentimes having a good relationship with people and relational apologetics is so important, because I'm telling you this kind of forcefully, that it's nonsense to think that science can answer those questions. But if somebody has held those ideas very dear and been brought up that way and feels very strongly about them, it's not helpful to just kind of bang at them. You've got to find a gentle way of helping them see. And this may take time, because these are often very deeply felt intuitions that people have, even if they're irrational.
I mean, we all fully agree that the Bible is not a scientific book,
yeah.
Obviously. But it seems that, nevertheless, for some theologians, there were some passages which are quite interesting, which I was thinking about is Job 26. I'm not a theologist, so I cannot assess this, but it's saying he hanged the earth upon nothing. I think there are other passages going a bit more into scientific topics. So how do you assess such passages in the light of science? Or how should we deal with, in general, with topics within the Bible?
That's a good question. So I think the Bible is written. In fact, there's some great quotes I have from John Calvin. I think was actually done somewhere not too far from here, in Geneva. But the Bible is not a scientific textbook. That is not to say that the Bible is wrong about scientific things. And I think I'll give you one example, which I think is the most interesting, by far the most interesting scientific example in the Bible. It's actually in the first chapter of Genesis. Okay, so what you see in the chapter in Genesis is that you've got morning and evening of the first day, morning of the second day, morning of the third day, and then on the fourth day, God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. Okay, and what's absolutely fascinating about that is that the words that are used in that passage, first of all, you don't have to be a modern scientist to realize you can't have morning and evening without the sun and the moon. So why does God create them on the fourth day? Okay, it's kind of strange. How do you have morning and evening without the sun and the moon? Why does God create them to the fourth day? The hint is that the words that are used there are not sun and moon, but greater lamp and lesser lamp. What is a lamp? A lamp is a physical thing you have in your tent. Now put yourself into the mindset of the people that were around when Genesis was being written. What was the intellectual scientists of the day? They were astrologers. They believed that the stars told us they were living beings, and the sun and the moon are living beings that tell us everything about ourselves. So if I were to go there in the intellectuals of the day, the scientists of the day, and tell them the sun and the moon are lamps, that would be as crazy as if I went to the astrophysics here at ETH and said the sun and the moon are living beings that control our lives. So they would laugh and kick me out. So what the Bible is doing there is saying something very strong to the readers at the time and completely crazy. Those are not living beings, they are physical objects up in the sky. Okay? There was no scientific proof for this until much, much, much later. Maybe Galileo's telescope or something, that you could look at them and realize these were not living beings. Otherwise, you had no reason to believe it or not believe it. Even Richard Dawkins, when he basically said, oh, the Bible, they really just got lucky, 50-50 chance they got lucky. That's why they got it right. But it's not true. The Bible makes a very strong scientific claim, which we don't recognize because we think it's obvious, right? But at the time, it was completely crazy. So I think that's the most interesting one of all. And there are other aspects. You see that the Bible talks about the natural world in many ways that are very interesting and very rich. And you have to remember that the writers at the time believed all kinds of crazy things about the natural world. And there are many things that are not put in the Bible. So I'll give you one last example. So in one of so there are these other Gospels. So I'm trying to remember which one it was. I think it's the Epistle to Barnabas, I think, which never entered into Scripture. And which one is it? The point is, in that one, it's one. There's lots of the people like Karen Armstrong and others who made a career out of telling us that there's these Gnostic Gospels that have been lost and suppressed and blah blah blah. But what's that? You read them, you can immediately see this has not been inspired by God because they include a lot of the strange things that people believed at the time. So that one says, everyone knows that in Arabia there's a phoenix that once every 500 years bursts into flame but is not consumed. Okay, and that's right. Now, did Paul believe that was true? Very possibly, because everybody believes it apparently, right? We don't think it's true. It's scientifically nonsense, right? But people believe lots of things of that nature. So why do we not see the story about the phoenix that burst into flame in the scripture that we believe God inspired? Is because God kept those things out. Right? Does that make sense? So I think it's only when you realize the context within which this was written that you realize how amazing it is that these really, really old books that were written in people whose thinking was very different from ours, that this kind of stuff didn't kind of slide in there in the way that you might have expected it to.